by Allen Motor Company, Blair Ridge Dental, the Billiard and Spa Gallery at Brancini's Flooring, and Hometown Restyling.
Welcome to the KCRG-TV9 50 Years of News Special.
We're excited to be sharing the last 50 years of big Eastern Iowa news stories with you.
Major news stories here in Eastern Iowa range from mysterious disappearances to fatal shootings.
We'll also take a look at how building an interstate affects the city and when weather becomes a news story. In some ways, covering news has not changed drastically in 50 years.
Our news crews still go to where news happens. Reporters and anchors bring you information live from the scene or the studio. The biggest change is speed and technology. As Dave Franzman reports, the phrase "good old days" doesn't apply to how we gather the news.
Good morning. I want to thank you all for coming this morning.
When news happens, you'll hear what people say, and you'll see what they're talking about. L.W. Ward followed a similar process when he was a TV9 news photographer back in the mid-1950s. But what he photographed and what you saw on the air looked a lot different than it does today. And it took a lot longer to prepare.
We had to come back, develop the film, dry it, put it in a projector and show it, which might take, with the primitive setup we had, it might be an hour before we could even look at it.
The first news film at TV9 was black and white with no sound at all, just like a silent movie. It looks ghostly now because the film came out as a negative image. The control room would turn it into something recognizable on home TVs. But the process wasn't quick or easy.
If it was after 9 o'clock in the evening, I would probably shoot Polaroid stills rather than even shooting movie film, because we simply did not have the capability of getting things on the air that quickly.
In the first years, reporters would type a script on paper. An anchor would then read a copy on the air. Now with computers, the words can flow instantly from the newsroom to the person telling the story. Future years brought innovations like live remote microwave trucks, news helicopters, and even satellite connections. But bringing news into the modern age at TV9 probably started with the introduction of videotape.
In the mid to late 1970s, TV9 started going to the first generation of electronic news gathering cameras, videotape. In fact, this is an example right here of one that we used. It probably cost about $50,000 to $60,000 when new. In fact, that was probably about what you'd have to spend for a fairly nice home in Cedar Rapids 25 or 30 years ago. Well, obviously homes cost a lot more now, and the cameras have stayed about the same in price. So in that sense, technology has gotten cheaper.
Dave Carter reported the news and shot film for TV9 with a camera very much like this one. He didn't dream about things we take for granted now.
And there were occasions when we would send something to the network instead of doing a satellite feed. We had to run it out to the airport to make sure we got it on an airplane so that it could get to Chicago or New York or wherever.
Some early pioneers at TV9 say it makes you wonder, will we recognize the TV news process 50 years from now? Dave Franzman, KCRG, TV9 News.
Some of the TV9 News pioneers say the number of stories you see in a typical newscast is another change. It's a far greater number than the newscasts of 50 years ago. 13 years ago, on a cold, snowy November afternoon, a horrific tragedy struck the University of Iowa.
A disgruntled graduate student killed 5 people and then turned the gun on himself. KCRG-TV9's Edie Fawcett was on the scene that afternoon and takes a look back at the deadliest day in university history.
Graduate student Gang Lu opened fire inside 2 buildings on the University of Iowa campus. He was angry about being overlooked for an academic award. He killed the student who beat him in the scholarship competition, his physics professors, and the U of I administrator who denied his appeal. 5 people dead, 1 other injured. He then turned the gun on himself.
Mike, you and I were on the scene here at Van Allen Hall shortly after the shootings happened, and I remember for the first time in all of my reporting, I was apprehensive and actually frightened to come here because we didn't know where the gunman was. We didn't know if he was dead or alive.
I remember just dropping everything, getting in a truck and getting down here. And I remember we got a call that there might be a shooting on campus or something crazy is going on. Get down there as fast as you can. And when we got here, it was just a scene of chaos. You know,
all
there
kinds
were
of people
all
milling
over the place, and we really didn't know what was going on because everybody who knew everything was inside the building or they were down at Jessup.
One person caught in the crossfire, the only survivor, Mia Siosin. She was working in Administrator T.Ann Cleary's office as a secretary the day the gunman came to kill her boss. Siosin met Gong Lu for the first time that day.
First didn't want to come out, but then she decided to come out and speak to him. And I just went back to work at my desk. And then a little while later I heard the pop, the gunshot. And then right after that, after I turned my head, another gunshot.
That second gunshot hit Siosin just below the neck, striking her spine and paralyzing most of her body.
It certainly took a while to figure out what happened while I was lying on the floor. And I remember when the paramedics came, I was still unconscious. And I told them that I couldn't move my toes, I couldn't move my feet.
Siosin is now a champion for the disabled, living in Berkeley, California with her mother and one brother. It's a long way from Iowa City and the incident that changed her life. In Iowa City, Edie Fawcett, KCRG-TV9 News.
A permanent memorial sits outside the U of I physics building. The university usually places flowers and a wreath there each November 1st to remember the victims. Who can think about the 1980s in Iowa without remembering a paper boy named Johnny Gosch?
Or news anchor Jody Husentrut, who mysteriously disappeared from Mason City. KCRG-TV9's Craig Brown takes a look at some of the more unusual stories and unsolved mysteries of the last 50 years.
As a child who grew up in the 1980s in Iowa, a pair of famous abductions made our parents and school teachers watch us a little closer. On September 5th, 1982, Des Moines Register paperboy Johnny Gosch vanished from his route just a few blocks from his home. Then 2 years later, Eugene Martin disappeared under the same circumstances. We all watched over the years as Johnny's mother, Noreen Gosch, painfully followed bizarre leads from psychics to strangers, leading the family from Des Moines to Mexico. Then in 1997, Noreen claimed her son came to visit her.
What he wanted was help, and he gave me names of people to investigate, and he said, try to do something, Mom, so that someday I can come out and tell my story and be safe.
Both cases are still considered open today. And who could forget the mysterious disappearance of Mason City anchor Jody Husentrut? She was reported missing after she failed to report to her early morning shift at KIMT. Over the years, Mason City police followed up on 1,500 different leads without ever finding her. A judge declared Husentrut legally dead in May of 2001 at the request of her parents. One case that did find closure, the murders of 52-year-old Barbara Garber of rural Watchir and 18-year-old Island Schultz of rural Gibson. Mahaska County stepbrothers Jamie McMahon and Chris Kaufman confessed to killing the two women back in 1997. They said they were high on meth when they killed the women, stole their cars, and robbed a bank. But perhaps even more bizarre is the joyride they took to Disney World following the crimes. The duo picked up two girls, Amanda Miller and Mandy Smith, and took them along for part of the ride. The girls later learned of the crimes and escaped.
Because we just thought we'd leave for 2 weeks, go to Disney World and come home and, slip back into our little lives and everything was going to be normal.
A trucker called police after seeing the brothers' faces on America's Most Wanted. The two men are now in separate federal prisons serving life sentences. Another strange case that also came to an end involved Laura Dalton and Maria Lehner. Jonathan Memmer is now serving life in prison for killing Dalton and Lehner back in March of 1999. Memmer burned their bodies in an Iowa City apartment to conceal his crimes. At the time of his conviction, however, the court couldn't force him to listen to the grief of the victims' families.
You coward bastard! Just a moment.
You came along and killed our baby.
Then in 2002, Governor Tom Vilsack signed a bill that changed that. Now, if victims' families want to, they can force convicted criminals to listen to what are known as victim impact statements.
The Johnny Gosch and Eugene Martin cases did spark positive changes that help other missing children, from putting pictures on milk cartons to the Amber Alert system we have today. Most of the stories we'll talk about in depth today happened in the last 20 years or so of KCRG's 50 years on the air.
Now we'd like to take a look at some of the top stories making headlines from KCRG-TV9's early years. Back in February 1959, 3 rock and roll stars died in a plane crash near Mason City. A plane carrying 22-year-old Buddy Holly, 17-year-old Richie Valens, and 24-year-old J.P. Richardson crashed shortly after takeoff. The three had just finished a performance at a Clear Lake ballroom. The Iowa pilot of the plane was also killed.
In early 1968, the Iowa Electric Light and Power Company announced plans to build Iowa's first and only atomic power plant in eastern Iowa. The power plant took several years to build and cost $250 million. When it went online in 1974, the plant produced 515 megawatts of electricity.
Another big story in 1968, a devastating tornado hit the towns of Charles City, Maynard, and Olwine on May 15th. A total of 17 lives were lost that day, 13 in Charles City, 2 in Olwine, and 2 in Maynard. The tornadoes caused about $60 million in damage.
In May 1970, police arrested 225 people protesting on the University of Iowa's Pentacrest. The majority of those arrested were staging a peaceful sit-in on the old Capitol steps, but several protesters did break into 2 Pentacrest buildings. The students were protesting U.S. involvement in Cambodia.
And in 1985, thousands of Southside Cedar Rapids residents were evacuated after a fire at the old water pollution control plant. The fire broke out during demolition of the plant. Residents living downwind of the fire were evacuated because the smoke contained toxic hydrochloric acid. Shifting gears now to Interstate 380, a road that opened for business in the early 80s.
The arrival of the interstate made it easier to transport everything from raw materials to football fans on Saturday afternoons. KCRG-TV9 reporter Mike Wagner tells how the road project got started.
Interstate 380 is our path to work. It's the road that gets us to our relatives' homes. Without 380's 4 lanes, we'd be bumper to bumper on 2-lane highways. And while the idea for this stretch of super interstates started in the 1950s, Eastern Iowans didn't get to take the whole road for a spin for another 30 years.
They were very aware of that it was never getting done, and that it was talked about since 1957, and we didn't see any construction in the city till the early 1970s. We didn't see major sections of it open until the 1980s, and it ended up being almost a generational situation where, will this freeway ever get built through Cedar Rapids, Iowa?
Historians say the biggest roadblock was the road's path through Cedar Rapids. It took time to buy homes, move families, build overpasses, and a new dam.
It connects us with the rest of the nation. It connects us to all the other major urban areas of the country. And it's just as important to 20th century development for eastern Iowa as the railroad was to 19th century.
And due to the delays, I-380 never got a proper send-off. People were just happy to have a little more of the road to drive on.
Because it would open up from one exit to another, and it would open up in half-mile segments or mile segments or even shorter segments.
Interstate's complicated construction made 380 one of the last major roads built through a town instead of around it. In Cedar Rapids, Mike Wagner, KCRG-TV9 News.
Once I-380 was built, the old road it replaced was renamed. Today, we know it as Highway 965. Coming up, a look at some of the stories that put Iowa in the national spotlight.
A guy got shot down at Little Bill's on Lower Dubuque Street. It was a kind of a tavern nightclub, and a guy shot another guy, and it was right during lunch hour.
Over the past 50 years, we've experienced several events that have not only touched our lives here in eastern Iowa, but have brought national attention to the state.
KCRG-TV9 reporter Angie Hunt takes a look back at some of those moments and how Iowans responded when under the spotlight.
The images from United Flight 232 will always stay with Peter Tian. It was the first disaster the Red Cross volunteer ever responded to, and something he never experienced before.
And as a funeral director, people say, well, you're used to death and destruction. We're used to death in a professional way, but not of that magnitude, not of that emotional intensity that we were experiencing up there.
112 people were killed during the crash, but 184 passengers survived. Tian says that day in 1989 has forever changed the way we respond to disasters.
The Iowa response was a dramatic response, and it had a dramatic impact on every family that was touched by a major disaster since 1989.
The custody battle over baby Jessica may have been just as emotional for many Iowans. It divided the community of Blairstown as well as the country. For 2 years, Jan and Robbie DeBoer of Ann Arbor, Michigan, fought to keep baby Jessica.
She knew that our hearts were broken, and she just kept saying, "It will be okay, Mommy. It will be okay, Daddy."
Eventually, the courts ruled in 1993 the little girl was to return to her biological parents in Iowa.
They were told they had not properly terminated my rights and I wanted my daughter back. It was only 9 days after they were appointed as temporary guardians they were told the real father's rights were not terminated and he wanted his daughter back. 9 days, not 2 years.
A more recent event that captured the national spotlight, Luke Helder and his string of mailbox pipe bombs. The 21-year-old planted a total of 18 bombs across 5 states before he was arrested. Dolores Worling was injured by one of the mailbox bombs.
It happened, and it's all said and done, and I go on with my life, and I'm not saying I don't think about it. I have no nightmares. My faith has pulled me through, plus my husband, plus my family.
Helder is currently undergoing a medical evaluation. And one final event that touched U of I alumni across the country, the old Capitol fire.
You just started to feel sad because that is the structure on campus that everybody who's been through the University of Iowa or been associated with the university can identify and identify with.
An asbestos removal company sparked the fire that caused more than $5 million in damage.
It was, I think, the one element of our skyline. We don't have much of a skyline in Iowa City, and that was it, and it's not there anymore.
The old Capitol Dome has since been rebuilt and returned to the Iowa City skyline. Angie Hunt, KCRG-TV9 News.
Another event that brings national attention to Iowa, the state's first in the nation caucuses. We'll take a closer look at how being in the political spotlight affects Iowa, coming up in our next 50th anniversary special, 50 Years of News plus Politics. Weather happens every day. Up next, we'll take a look at when weather becomes a news event.
Well, I think the flood in '93, we had water clearing in our basement. It upset all the stuff, and we had to get rid of everything.
Over the past 50 years, we've covered dozens of weather stories all across Iowa, and many times Iowa's severe weather makes major news headlines.
We all remember the tornado that struck the town of Washington in 1998. There's also the floods of not only 2004, but 1993, when we seemed to have high water from March through September.
And how could we forget the Iowa farm crisis brought on partially by a major drought? KCRG-TV9's Nick Glue takes a look.
Alan Plattner has farmed his Lynn County land for several decades. Through the farm crisis of the 80s, droughts and floods, he's been tested many times. Yet each year he climbs into his tractor and continues to plant crops. But in 1988, he wondered if any crops would grow. It was one of the driest years on record.
That was one of the worst years that I can remember. It started in May and never led up till sometime in the first part of September.
He remembers that 0.8 of an inch of rain fell on Mother's Day that year, but after that it was only sprinkles at a time throughout the entire summer.
And sometimes you get close enough that you could hear the raindrops and smell it, but it just never landed on you. And so you keep saying, come on, rain, it can do it. We know it can. But, it's one of those things you've learned to live with over the years.
But Iowa weather comes in extremes. In 1993, some of the worst floods the state has ever seen. Maybe not because of how much rain fell, but because of the way floods seem to make headlines the entire year.
Sometimes you gotta limit the sandbags and stuff to people because you gotta have enough to go around.
It first started as early as March.
What you see behind me is a pretty typical example of the kind of situation we've had today and yesterday with the frozen ground and the ice and snow buildup that we've had. The water that would normally drain away gets trapped in these areas and it can't soak in.
and lasted through September. Hardly anyone stayed dry that entire year. In Iowa City alone, there was more than $8 million in damage to city property. But Iowa's weather can get even worse. On May 15, 1998, the town of Washington was hit with weather that no one there will soon forget.
They said a tornado had touched down, and I went back to the basement and didn't make it to the basement. And by the time I got down, all the glass was flying out.
But for this Iowa farmer who's survived through all kinds of weather, he says living here is worth it.
I guess overall, I've had a good life, and I think most farmers can say that.
Nick Glue, KCRG-TV9 News.
Most of the stories we've seen today have been on the dark side. Coming up, a feel-good story about the 7 from heaven.
I think it was 93 when we had the storm that left water here for several weeks, and you just couldn't get through on many of the streets. I remember Coralville was almost isolated, and we just couldn't believe how much water could come down and how long it took for it to get away.
Nearly 7 years ago, an Iowa couple made history by giving birth to septuplets.
Bobby and Kenny McCoy of Carlisle are the first parents to have all 7 babies survive. The extremely rare pregnancy captured attention worldwide and captivated hearts when people finally saw the 7 from heaven.
This is one of the most blessed events that I've ever encountered.
The world waited for it and then watched it unfold the day Carlisle's population increased by 7.
The fact that we want to tell the world about what has happened here in this little old Iowa, where the tall corn grows, you know, and the babies do too.
On November 19th, 1997, all 7 babies were born in 6 minutes, no bigger than a half loaf of bread. They weighed only 2 to 3 pounds each.
It was just incredible. I can't wait until I can hold all of them.
The first 2 months were tenuous for Kenny, Alexis, Natalie, Kelsey, Nathan, Brandon, and Joel. Wires stretched from their bodies and attached to monitors and machines. But one by one, they got stronger. The first of the set going home in mid-January to the last 2 in March.
It's great. Finally, everybody under one roof. Woo!
Going from a family of 3 to 10 is life-changing. Corporate and community donations, from a new van to a new house, have helped the McCoys adapt. The families graced the covers of many magazines, including Time, Newsweek, and the Ladies' Home Journal. Through the years, some of the septuplets have been dealing with significant health and learning issues, problems more often associated with multiples and preemies. And yet, the McCoy septuplets continued to defy the odds, each with their own personalities and potential. For the first time in their lives, the septuplets are not spending every day together. At school, they're scattered among 6 kindergarten classes. The 7 will turn 7 years old this November 19th. And thanks for joining us for the KCRG-TV9 50 Years of News Special.
We've enjoyed looking back at the big stories and events that we've covered during our 50 years on the air, as well as hearing from our viewers what they remember.
Again, thanks for watching, and we hope you'll continue to celebrate with us through the rest of the year.